I jolted awake in a pool of blood, gasping for air. My hands instinctively flew to my abdomen, where there should have been 17 stab wounds. No wounds. No blood. Just soft pajamas and unbroken skin. Julia, why are you spacing out? That familiar voice made every muscle in my body tense. I looked up and saw Jason Miller standing in the living room, a thin, small boy beside him. This seemed too familiar. Far too familiar. The calendar on the wall read April 15, 2018. I had been reborn 5 years back to the day the devil first entered my home. This is Owen, Jason said, rubbing his hands awkwardly, eyes darting away. His mom had an accident. There's no one to take care of him. I stared at the boy Owen Parker, 8 years old, barely 4 feet tall, wearing an ill-fitting cartoon t-shirt, looking harmless and innocent. But I knew what hid beneath that skin. In my previous life, that same harmless boy stabbed out my daughter Abigail Scott's eyes with a pencil. 5 years later, he escaped from a psychiatric hospital. Murdered my parents, outright scorn. Tortured and mutilated my Abigail. And finally butchered me piece by piece. Julia? Jason's voice trembled slightly. I know this is hard to accept, but he's just a child innocent. Innocent? I almost laughed out loud. I'd believed that once and it had cost my entire family their lives. I understand. My voice came out calm, too calm. The child is innocent. I walked toward Owen and crouched down until we were eye to eye. Those eyes dark, cold, devoid of any childish warmth. He looked at me the way a butcher looks at livestock waiting for slaughter. Welcome home, Owen. I smiled, reaching out to pat his head. He flinched back, and a sharp sting sliced across my wrist. I looked down, blood welled from a thin, fresh cut. He had something sharp hidden in his hand. Owen, Jason barked. How could you do that to your aunt? Instantly the boy's face changed, eyes glistening, lips trembling. I'm sorry, Auntie, I didn't mean to. I was just scared. Perfect performance. In my past life, I'd fallen for that act. It's okay, I said softly, pulling a bandage from the drawer and patching my wrist. Kids get nervous. Owen's gaze swept across the room, then he suddenly dashed toward the display cabinet. This is so pretty, he exclaimed, reaching for my mother's antique vase. Don't, Jason began, but it was too late. The vase hit the floor and shattered into glittering fragments. I'm sorry, Owen cried, shoulders shaking. I just wanted to look at it. Auntie must hate me now. I stared at his tear-streaked face and at the broken remains of the only thing my mother left me. In my past life, I comforted him then, said it was fine, it was just a vase. That mistake had opened the door to hell. What a shame, I murmured. It was the only thing my mother left me. Owen's sobs stopped. He looked up, startled. He hadn't expected that response. Julia, the boy didn't mean. Jason started again. I know. I cut him off, my voice flat. I just need some time alone. Get him settled. I turned, walked into my bedroom, closed the door, and slowly slid down against it. The mirror reflected the face of a 30-year-old woman, untouched yet by agony or hatred. I pressed a trembling hand to the glass. Tears finally spilled over. I had truly been reborn. Images from my previous death flashed in my mind. Abigail's naked corpse, her skin full of needles, her mouth stuffed with the mutilated body of her puppy. My parents, dismembered beyond recognition. Myself, carved apart, screaming until my voice broke. This time, I wiped my tears, staring coldly at my reflection. This time, you and your father will beg for death before I let you die. I picked up my phone and dialed a number. Hello, is this the security company? I need a discreet surveillance system installed. Top of the line. Revenge had begun. The sizzling of fried eggs filled the kitchen, masking the faint hum of the microcameras. 3 days ago, I'd installed 12 hidden surveillance units throughout the house. For anti-theft, of course, every corner, covered except the bathroom. Morning, Auntie. That chilling voice came from behind me. I turned. Owen Parker stood in the doorway. An 8-year-old should look sleepy or playful, but his eyes were cold, alert, reptilian. Good morning, Owen. I plated the eggs with a calm smile. Sleep well? He stared at my hands. Dad said you're taking me to school from today. That's right. I crouched slightly, smiling. Are you excited? He grinned suddenly, showing uneven teeth. Yeah. Excited. That smile identical to the one he'd worn years later, standing over Abigail's corpse. Go wake your dad and sister, I said, patting his shoulder. He stiffened under my touch, then turned and walked away. As soon as he left, I pulled out my phone and opened the surveillance app. 12 small screens appeared. In one of them, Owen stood silently outside Abigail's bedroom door. Not moving. My heart pounded. In my last life, this was when he'd first started to harm her. Abigail, time to get up, I called, deliberately raising my voice. On screen, Owen flinched, then plastered on a fake smile. He knocked on her door. Sis, wake up. I exhaled slowly, tucking the phone away. Too early to expose him now. At the breakfast table, Jason Miller sat bleary-eyed, scrolling through his phone. Abigail Scott rubbed her eyes, staring sleepily at the strange new brother who had suddenly appeared. Mom, do I really have to go to school with Owen today? Abigail Scott asked softly, her small hand clutching mine. Of course, I said, gently stroking her hair. Your brother will protect you. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught a flicker of something sharp and sinister in Owen Parker's gaze. After dropping the two children off at school, I didn't leave right away. Instead, I went straight to the principal's office. Mrs. Miller, the principal looked a little surprised. Is something wrong? I hesitated, wearing a troubled expression. It's about my stepson, Owen Parker. His former teacher mentioned he might have some minor behavioral issues. I just wanted to make sure the school could keep an eye on him. The principal frowned. What kind of issues exactly? Mostly aggression. I sighed softly. But he's just overly sensitive. He needs more patience and care, that's all. Before leaving, I made a detour to the playground. Through the fence, I spotted Owen Parker cornering a smaller boy against the wall. I was too far away to hear what he said, but the other child was already crying. I stood there until Owen noticed me. He froze for a moment, then flashed an angelic smile and waved. I smiled back, waving gently before turning away. Let him reveal his nature. It was all part of my plan. At 3 o'clock, my phone rang. It was Abigail's homeroom teacher. Mrs. Miller, could you come to the school? There's been an incident. Owen had a conflict with another student. When I arrived, the furious woman was shouting at the discipline officer. My son's arm is bleeding, that little psycho bit him, he should be expelled. In the corner, Owen stood with his head bowed, shoulders trembling as if he were crying. Abigail was beside him, pale and shaken. What happened? I hurried over. Mom. Abigail threw herself into my arms. Owen Owen suddenly looked up, tears welling in his eyes, cutting her off. That boy said I'm a motherless freak and he pushed my sister. I just wanted to protect her, so I bit him. He was lying. I could tell. But I crouched down and pulled him gently into my arms. You protected your sister, I said softly. That was the right thing to do. The teacher and the angry mother both looked stunned. Mrs. Miller, the teacher began carefully, he bit the other child hard enough to draw blood. But the other child started it, didn't he? I said evenly. Owen only overreacted in self-defense. Would you like me to bring in a lawyer to discuss campus bullying? 10 minutes later, the matter was resolved with the other parent apologizing. As we left the school, Owen glanced up at me, a trace of confusion in his eyes. Why did you help me? He asked. Because we're family now, I said with a smile. But inside, I was thinking, Ming. I'll make sure you commit enough crimes to be locked in a psychiatric ward for life. That night, after putting Abigail to bed, I opened my laptop and checked the surveillance footage. During the hours when no one was home, the camera in Owen's room had captured something chilling. He'd cut Abigail's favorite doll into tiny pieces with scissors, then arranged them neatly on his bed like some kind of dark ritual. I saved the video and encrypted the file. This was just the beginning. The next day, the private investigator I'd hired sent an email. I paid triple to make him prioritize my case and investigation into Jason Miller. What I read made me laugh bitterly. Jason had been transferring 20,000 yuan a month to the same account for 5 years. The recipient, Lauren Mitchell, Owen Parker's biological mother. But that wasn't all. Jason had a gambling habit, and in the past 6 months, he'd racked up over 2 million yuan in debt to loan sharks. No wonder he was suddenly so desperate to bring his son home. I murmured to myself, so that's what you were hiding last time. In my previous life, I divorced him too quickly to uncover any of this. Then my phone buzzed. A text from Jason. Working late tonight. Don't wait up for dinner. I replied, okay. Take care of yourself. Then I immediately called the investigator. Find out where he's really going tonight. I want photo evidence. Later, after Abigail fell asleep, I quietly entered Owen's room. He was pretending to sleep, but I saw his eyelids twitch. I know you're awake, I whispered. Tell me, about today at school, were you really just protecting your sister? His eyes snapped open, dark and cold. You don't believe me? I do, I said softly, sitting on the edge of his bed. But you have to understand, some people deserve to be punished. Like who? His eyes gleamed with interest. Dad? I feigned alarm. I didn't say that. Go to sleep. As I left his room, I knew the seed had been planted. Violence came naturally to what I just needed to guide it toward the right target. His father. Around midnight, the investigators' photos arrived. Jason Miller hadn't been working late at all. He'd been at a casino. And there were more photos. Jason, with a heavily made-up woman, his arm draped around her as they entered a hotel. I saved the images in a locked folder, labeled simply, Divorce Evidence. Over the weekend, I took Abigail to her first self-defense class. It was the most direct way I could think of to protect her. Mom, why are we suddenly learning this? She asked, puzzled. Because girls need to learn how to protect themselves, I said, helping her tie her belt. Especially when there's an unstable person around. Abigail blinked. You mean no one? Yesterday he strangled my hamster. Every drop of blood in my body went cold. What did he do? He said he was just playing with it, but then it stopped moving, she whispered, eyes welling up. He told me if I told anyone he'd kill my rabbit next. I dropped to my knees and pulled her tightly into my arms. Anger roared through my chest like fire. This time, I swore silently, he won't hurt anyone ever again. In my previous life, it started with small animals and then it was Abigail Scott. Listen, sweetie, I said, cupping Abigail's face in my hands. From now on, don't ever be alone with your brother. If he tries to hurt you or your pet, scream and run away, understand? Abigail nodded. I kissed her forehead, silently adjusting the timeline of my revenge plan. Things had to move faster. On the way home, I bought a new hamster. When Owen Parker saw it, a flash of irritation crossed his face. He didn't like his works being replaced. Auntie has a request for you. I called him into the kitchen, lowering my voice. Can you keep an eye on Abigail Scott? She's been sneaking onto the balcony lately, and I'm worried. The balcony? His eyes lit up. Yes, I said, feigning concern. She likes to play with her hamster there and accidents could happen. Owen Parker smiled. I'll watch over my sister carefully. I knew exactly what he was thinking. But the balcony cameras would record everything. That night I checked the footage. Sure enough, Owen had gone to the balcony. He tried to open the hamster cage, but it was locked with a small padlock I had secretly installed that afternoon. He kicked the cage in frustration, then pulled something from his pocket and smeared it along the edge. I zoomed in. It was a tube of glue. He planned that the next time Abigail opened the cage, her hands would be stuck, unable to escape. I saved the clip, noting the timestamp. Jason Miller hadn't come home for 3 days. Clearly, gambling debts and his mistress mattered more than family. The next morning, Owen was unusually quiet at breakfast. That is, until Abigail said she wanted to go see the hamster on the balcony. His face lit up with anticipation. Wait, I interjected. Help Mom set the table first, okay? Owen's expression darkened instantly. Once Abigail headed to the kitchen, he glared at me. You did this on purpose. What? I feigned ignorance. You locked the cage. And now you're not letting her go. His voice was almost a growl. Oh, the hamster. I acted as if it had just clicked. I heard some kids were hurting animals, so I locked it. Did you know about this kind of thing? His eyes turned dangerous, the malice in his expression far beyond his age. You're lying. You don't like me at all. Of course I do, I said softly, pressing the record button on my phone in my pocket. Tell me the truth, Owen, were you planning to hurt your sister's pet? I want it dead. He blurted it out just like with the vase, just like all her things. Why does she get so much? Dad said this house would be mine one day. Perfect. Recording secured. Owen, I said, feigning hurt. How could you think that way? She likes you so much. She's disgusting, he screamed. You're all disgusting. When I grow up, I'll... Grow up and do what? Jason Miller's voice suddenly came from the doorway. He returned home and noticed, looking exhausted, dark circles under his eyes. Owen Parker froze, then threw himself into his father's arms, crying. Dad, Auntie says I'm a bad kid and she's going to send me away. I watched quietly, saying nothing. Jason Miller gave me a tired glance and led Owen into the study. An hour later, he emerged, his tone indifferent. The child lacks a sense of security. You should be more tolerant. He's lying, I said calmly. He's only 8. How much ill intent can he really have? Jason waved his hand impatiently. I've had a lot of work stress lately. Stop bothering me with these little things. Little things, I muttered, watching his back as he walked to the bathroom, gripping my phone tightly in my pocket. Soon, he would realize just how important these little things could be. My cheek burned. In the mirror, a patch of abnormal red rash had formed on my right cheekbone, like a severe allergic reaction. I touched it lightly. The sting made me gasp. Owen Parker thought he had succeeded. The cream on the sink looked normal, but I knew it had been tampered with. The surveillance footage from last night clearly showed him sneaking into the master bathroom at 200 Setagina. Injecting some liquid into my face cream with a syringe. I tightened the cap, put the jar in a drawer, and retrieved an identical new bottle from the back of the cabinet. 3 days ago, I had replaced all my skincare products with sealed, untouched bottles. The ones on the counter were just bait. Julia, are you ready yet? Jason Miller called impatiently from the bedroom. I'm going to be late for work. Almost, I replied, covering the rash with concealer enough to be noticeable, but not exaggerated. When Jason saw my face, he froze. What happened to your face? I don't know, I said, pretending to be troubled. It suddenly broke out. Maybe the new cream doesn't suit me. He frowned, glancing at me. Go see a doctor. Then he left in a hurry without even a goodbye kiss. I watched his car leave the neighborhood, then returned to the bathroom and retrieved the micro camera hidden behind a towel rack. The footage from last night still needed to be analyzed. I had to know exactly what Owen had put in my cream. My phone vibrated. It was my father. Julia, that Forex risk you mentioned last week? Genius. The central bank issued a new policy this morning. Without your tip, the company would have lost at least 20 million. That's good, Dad, I said with a smile. One huge advantage of being reborn was knowing the economic trends of the next few years. By the way, is your face okay? You looked unwell in yesterday's video. I felt a warmth in my chest. In my previous life, my father had worried about me and Abigail until the very end. I'm fine, I said. Just a minor allergic reaction. Take care of yourself, he said. My father paused for a moment. By the way, next week is the board meeting. Will you be attending? Everyone's eager to hear your insights on the Southeast Asian market. I'll be there, I replied. Hanging up, a small smile lifted the corners of my lips. In my previous life, I'd thrown myself entirely into family matters, neglecting my business talents. This time, I would seize control of the family business resources. Revenge required both money and power. Heading downstairs, I saw Owen Parker sitting at the breakfast table, eyes fixed on Abigail Scott's milk cup. The moment he noticed me, he flashed an innocent smile. "Good morning, Auntie." "Morning, Owen," I said. I pretended not to notice the brief glint in his eyes and turned to Abigail. "Sweetie, drink up, your school bus will be here soon." Abigail hurriedly finished her milk, and I noticed a flicker of disappointment cross Owen's face. It seemed the milk had been altered. Fortunately, I'd warned Abigail the night before not to drink the house milk, and she had a boxed one in her bag. After dropping the kids off, I immediately contacted a chemical analyst to test the face cream sample. Then I drove to my father's company to prepare for the upcoming board meeting. By 3 o'clock, the test results hit my inbox. The cream had been laced with sodium hydroxide, at a concentration high enough to cause severe chemical burns. I saved the report, another piece of crucial evidence. On my way home, Jason Miller called, his voice dejected. "Julia, I might be demoted." "Oh?" I feigned concern, pulling over to focus on the call. "That damn Aaron Collins. He stole my clients and bad-mouthed me in front of the CEO." Jason ground his teeth. "I might have to work late tonight to fix this. We'll be home for dinner." "Don't be too discouraged," I said softly. "You're talented, you'll get through it." After hanging up, I opened my contacts and dialed Aaron Collins. Marin had been Jason's competitor, once imprisoned for corporate bribery in my previous life. Now, he was a potential ally. "Aaron Collins, this is Julia Reed, Jason Miller's wife," I said bluntly. "Do you have time for a coffee? I'd like to discuss some business matters regarding my husband." An hour later, I sat across from the shrewd Aaron Collins in a high-end Hotel Ciano. I pushed a USB drive toward him. It contained 6 months' worth of Jason Miller's client records, including private discounts and some slightly irregular kickbacks. Aaron raised an eyebrow. "Why are you helping me?" "Because he betrayed me." I brushed my still sore cheek and added, "And I hear your company's VP position is still vacant." Miss Julia, clever as always. Aaron smiled. "But why not take the position yourself? Your business acumen far exceeds your husband's." "I have other plans," I said, sipping my coffee. "But we can certainly help each other." Leaving the hotel, my phone rang. It was Owen Parker's homeroom teacher. "Mrs. Miller, can you come to school? Owen Parker caused another incident, and this one serious." When I arrived, the office was in chaos. Noah was being tended to by the nurse, clutching a bleeding arm, while his mother screamed hysterically, threatening to call the police. Owen Parker stood in the corner, an eerie calm on his face. He slashed Justin Hayes with a craft knife, the trembling teacher said. If we hadn't intervened in time, the consequences would have been disastrous. I looked at Owen, and he immediately switched to a look of innocence. He insulted my mom, first called her a lunatic in a mental hospital. Lies. My Justin Hayes would never say that. A thought crossed my mind. Mental illness, that's new information. No matter the reason, violence could not be tolerated. I spoke firmly, then turned to the teacher. But I knew Owen needed professional psychological evaluation, not mere punishment. This child had been through far too much trauma. After some negotiation, the school agreed not to call the police, on the condition that Owen Parker undergo psychological therapy and take a week off school. On the way home, Owen was unusually quiet. Almost home, he spoke suddenly. "You know my mother really is in a mental hospital, right?" I gripped the steering wheel tighter. I didn't know. She always said someone wanted to kill her, burned all my toys. One time, she took a knife and slit her wrist. She said the demons and the blood would come out. I finally understood the source of Owen Parker's violent tendencies. Genetics plus environment, a perfect recipe for a little demon. "You must feel sad, huh?" I asked softly. He turned to me, eyes cold. No, I find it interesting. The blood shooting from her wrist like a little red fountain. My chill ran down my spine, but I remained composed. You can stay home and rest for a while. I'll get you the best psychologist available. I don't need a doctor, he sneered. The people who need doctors are the ones who cross me. That night, Jason Miller came home drunk, his face worse than it had been that morning. All gone, that bastard Darren Collins stole all my clients. The CEO wants to transfer me to logistics. He collapsed on the sofa, tight-crooked. How did this happen? I feigned surprise, pouring him a glass of water, secretly suppressing a cold smile. This was just the beginning. Someone leaked my client data. Jason suddenly looked up at me suspiciously. You haven't told anyone about my work, have you? My heart raced, but my expression remained neutral. I don't even know what projects you're working on. Want something to eat? He shook his head, swaying slightly. I'm going to bed tomorrow. I have to face that bunch of jerks again. Once he went upstairs, I immediately contacted the private investigator. I want everything on Lauren Mitchell, especially her mental health history. If you want, I can continue translating the next part where Julia uses this intelligence to manipulate Owen and Jason, maintaining the tense psychological thriller style. Do you want me to continue? 3 days later, a thick folder arrived at my hands. Lauren Mitchell, Owen Parker's biological mother, was 32, with a 10-year history of schizophrenia, currently residing in a psychiatric hospital on the city outskirts. The folder included copies of her medical records, documenting auditory hallucinations, paranoid delusions, and repeated self-harm. Most strikingly, the records revealed that Lauren Mitchell had continued taking multiple antipistatiffic medications while pregnant, likely contributing to Owen Parker's congenital issues. I locked the files in the safe, then called to schedule an appointment with the city's most renowned child psychologist. I needed to create a comprehensive psychological profile for Owen Parker. This would be crucial evidence to justify his future long-term stay in a psychiatric facility. Over the weekend, I took Owen Parker to see the psychologist. On the way, he was unusually quiet. Nervous? I asked. No, he stared out the window. I was just thinking, if the doctor says I'm crazy, maybe I won't have to be responsible like Mom. My heart sank. An 8-year-old should never think like that. The evaluation lasted 3 hours. Afterwards, the doctor spoke to me privately. Julia Reed, your steps on his situation is complicated. The doctor pushed up his glasses. He shows marked antisocial tendencies, lacks empathy, has a history of animal abuse and hostility toward his sister. Can it be treated? I asked. Frankly, personality disorders like this are difficult to cure, he sighed. Especially with the family's psychiatric history. At this stage, behavior management and medication are the best we can do. I feigned worry. So he's dangerous? At his age, the risk is limited, the doctor reassured me. But as he grows, yes, he could pose a threat to others. I recommend strict supervision, especially of his younger sister. Leaving the clinic, Owen suddenly asked. Auntie, if I kill someone, would I go to jail? I fought back a chill. Why are you asking that? Just curious. He smiled, and the thought made me recall the photos in Lauren Mitchell's medical records, her telling him that mentally ill people who kill don't go to prison. Did your mother often tell you things like that? Not often, he replied, kicking a pebble along the sidewalk. Only when she was lucid. Otherwise, she was screaming or sleeping. Back home, I found Abigail Scott in the living room, drawing. When she saw us, she held up her artwork excitedly. Mom, brother, look, I drew a family portrait. The picture showed 4 figures, me, Abigail Scott, Jason Miller and Owen Parker. Everyone smiled, holding hands. Owen Parker stared at the drawing for a moment, then snatched it and tore it to pieces. We are not a family, he screamed. We never will be. Abigail cried. I quickly hugged her while carefully watching Owen's reaction. He stood among the shredded paper, breathing heavily, eyes wide eerily mirroring the symptoms described in Lauren Mitchell's records. Owen, I said calmly, go to your room and calm down. He glared at me, then stormed upstairs. I soothed Abigail, then immediately checked the surveillance footage. In his room, Owen began scribbling violently on the walls with a pencil, muttering under his breath. Kill them all just like Mom said. I saved the footage, my heart racing. The plan was unfolding faster than I'd expected. Owen was losing control, and I needed to finish setting the stage before he could harm Abigail Scott. That night, Jason Miller came home unusually early, bringing bad news. The company is sending you to the S-City branch for 6 months starting tomorrow. I feigned surprise. So sudden. All that bastard Darren Collins doing, he ground his teeth. It's basically exile. Maybe it's a fresh start, I said, pouring him a glass of wine. We and the kids can stay here, and Abigail Scott still has school. He downed a large gulp. Whatever, this house hasn't been mine for a long time anyway. I looked at the man I once loved with nothing left but disgust. But the performance must continue. Don't say that, we'll be here when you come back. Drunk, he fell asleep. Silently, I took his phone, unlocked it with the password I had long ago cracked, and reviewed his recent contacts and messages. Under a contact named Debt Collector, a series of chilling messages appeared. 1 more week, 500,000 or we'll take off your son's leg. Don't think we can't find your wife and child. I shivered. So that was why Jason had brought Owen Parker back, not just because Lauren Mitchell was hospitalized, but also to protect his son from high-interest loan sharks. How ironic, a father's love. I quickly photographed the messages, then opened Jason Miller's email. Among the work emails, I found a bill from the psychiatric hospital. Lauren Mitchell's monthly hospitalization fee, $20,000 per month, paid by Jason Miller. All the pieces were coming together: gambling debts, a lover's mental illness, a violent illegitimate child. Jason Miller's world was crumbling, and I was going to give him the final push. Back in my study, I opened my computer and organized a special folder labeled Custody Case Evidence. Inside, Owen Parker's psychological evaluation, proof of animal abuse and harm to classmates, Jason Miller's gambling debts, and the high-interest loan threats I had just obtained. Outside, lightning split the night sky, followed by the booming rumble of thunder. A storm was coming, just like the one I was about to unleash. The files were neatly arranged on my desk, each label clear. Psychological evaluation, animal abuse evidence, school violence records, home surveillance, loan shark evidence, misappropriation proof. I smoothed the last document, freshly arrived yesterday: Lauren Mitchell's complete medical records. One page was circled and read. Patient exhibits extreme violent tendencies toward her child. Has attempted to suffocate infant with a pillow, claiming she must end him before he becomes a demon. Suddenly, the phone rang. It was my lawyer. Julia Reed, the court has accepted our emergency custody petition. The hearing is scheduled for next Wednesday. But there's a complication. Jason Miller also submitted a response, claiming you deliberately triggered Owen Parker's psychological issues. I laughed coldly. Does he have any proof? There's a witness who can testify that you recently purchased a large amount of medication, my lawyer said. I glanced at the disguised medicine cabinet on the bookshelf. Sure enough, it contained diphenderamine and a few other medications. But Jason Miller would never find them. 3 days ago, I had flushed most of the drugs down the toilet, leaving only a single-use dose. Don't worry, I said calmly to myself. His witness will change their story soon enough. After hanging up with my lawyer, I opened my computer and pulled up Jason Miller's recent call logs. Sure enough, he had contacted our neighbor, Mrs. Noah Grant, an interfering old woman who loved peeking into other people's lives through their windows. I dialed her number. Mrs. Grant, I heard you've been in touch with Jason Miller recently. A tense silence followed. Finally, she said. Julia Reed, he asked about your household. I understand, I replied softly. Actually, I wanted to thank you. Jason told me you refused to lie for him. That's very honorable of you. She sounded clearly caught off guard. But he said. I interrupted gently, by the way, Isn't your son applying for a position at my father's company? What a coincidence, I just had lunch with the HR director yesterday. Another long silence. Finally, Mrs. Grant cleared her throat. Julia Reed, I'm too old and forgetful to lie for that gambler. Don't worry, I won't say a word. Thank you so much, Mrs. Grant, I said with a smile. I'll make sure to mention your son to the HR director. With that loose end secured, I went to check on Abigail Scott. She was drawing in her room. When she saw me, she held up her paper excitedly. Mom, look, I drew our new home. The picture showed sunshine, the sea, and a small house. No Owen Parker, no Jason Miller. A warmth spread through my chest. Do you want to live by the sea, sweetie? Yes, her eyes sparkled. Then there won't be any bad brother, right? I hugged her tightly, inhaling the faint scent of shampoo in her hair. The angel I couldn't protect in my previous life, this time, I would guard her with my life. Yes, no more bad brother, I whispered. 3 days before the hearing, I added the final dose to Owen Parker's dinner. This time, the amount was larger enough to keep him in a manic state for the next 48 hours. The effect was even stronger than expected. The next morning, I was awakened by screams. I rushed into Owen Parker's room. The scene was horrifying. He stood on the bed, clawing at his face, blood streaked everywhere, muttering, "Insects, there are bugs under my skin." I immediately called emergency services while recording the scene. By the time the medical team arrived, Owen had plunged into full-blown psychosis, attacking anyone who approached, including his father. This was a classic schizophrenic episode. The emergency doctor frowned. He needs immediate hospitalization. Jason Miller's face went pale. Impossible, he's never done this before. Genetics play a major role, I said, passing over Lauren Mitchell's medical records, proof that the child's biological mother had a serious psychiatric history. And just like that, Owen Parker was admitted to the city's strictest psychiatric hospital, King Shan Psychiatric Treatment Center. The custody hearing was advanced as a result. In court, I presented all my carefully prepared evidence. Owen Parker's psychological evaluation, records of harming classmates, videos of animal abuse, threats to my daughter, and his recent self-harming and aggressive behavior. Also included was Lauren Mitchell's mental health history, proving the hereditary nature of his problems. Jason Miller tried to rebut, but his gambling records and loan shark evidence made the judge frown. When he accused me of drugging Owen, the judge asked directly, "Where is the evidence?" Jason Miller was speechless. His witness, Mrs. Noah Grant, hadn't appeared. The final ruling exceeded my expectations. Divorce granted. Full custody of Abigail Scott awarded to me. Owen Parker required long-term psychiatric treatment, with custody assigned to the state. Family home and majority of assets awarded to me. As for Jason Miller, his nightmare had only just begun. 3 days after the hearing, the police arrested him for embezzlement and massive gambling debts, with my evidence playing a key role. A month later, I stood in the visitation room of King Shan Psychiatric Hospital, looking at Owen Parker through the blast-proof glass. The drugs had worn off, but he looked darker than ever. The new restraint marks on his wrists showed he was resisting treatment. "Antade," he said suddenly, his voice intervinglum calm, "this was you, wasn't it?" I raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "The medicine, the hallucinations," his unblinking eyes bore into mine. "You made me go crazy." I leaned forward slightly, careful that the cameras couldn't capture my lips. "You were crazy already, Owen. I just made sure everyone saw it clearly." His pupils dilated slightly, then a sinister smile appeared. "I'll get out. Then I'll find Abigail Scott and you." "No," I said with a quiet smile. "You won't." "Do you know why I chose this hospital?" He frowned, confused. "Because they have special methods," I whispered. "Electroshock. Medically induced coma. When you come out, if you ever do, you won't even remember your own name." For the first time his expression cracked. You can't." "I can," I said, standing. "For Abigail Scott, I can do anything." Before leaving, I glanced at him one last time. Oh, by the way, your father's in jail. No one will be coming for you ever. As I turned to leave, I heard the sound of glass shattering behind me, followed by Owen Parker's scream. I'll kill you. I'll kill all of you. The door shut behind me, muffling all the noise. In the corridor, I ran into his attending psychiatrist. Julia Reed, he adjusted his glasses, regarding your stepson's treatment plan. The most aggressive intervention, I supplied. I cut him off. Cost is not an issue. I have only one condition: he must never leave this hospital. The doctor looked momentarily surprised but quickly regained his professional composure. Given his danger and aggression, that is indeed our recommendation. Stepping out of the psychiatric hospital, the sunlight burned my eyes. I inhaled deeply, feeling the first sense of relief in 5 years. 3 months later, I moved with Abigail Scott and my parents to a coastal city thousands of miles away. My father handed over control of the company to his trusted assistant, keeping only his shareholder role. We bought a small white house by the sea, just like Abigail Scott had drawn. On moving day, I burned all documents related to Jason Miller and Owen Parker, keeping only a single encrypted backup just in case. Life in the new city was peaceful, almost unreal. Abigail Scott started school, made new friends. My parents fell in love with sea fishing, leaving early and returning late every day. And I finally began writing a novel about rebirth and revenge. One afternoon, a year later, I was writing on the balcony when the postman delivered a letter. It was from King Shansaiki at Work Treatment Center. I calmly opened it. Inside was a brief notice. Moan Parker passed away in his ward yesterday morning due to accidental asphyxiation, determined to be self-inflicted. I placed the letter on the candle and watched it turn to ash. The firelight illuminated my face but did nothing to warm my icy heart. Mom, come see the castle I built, Abigail Scott's voice rang from the beach. I stepped onto the balcony and saw my daughter waving happily in the sunset, standing before a delicate sand castle. Her smile outshone even the golden sunlight. I'm coming, I called back, my voice full of joy. Before turning, I cast one last glance at the burned remnants of the letter on the table. Then I walked toward the beach, toward my daughter, toward a life without shadows. The waves lapped the shore, carrying away the last remnants of ash. On my way to the college entrance exam, I was shoved into the river and missed the test, and because I caught a chill I later became infertile. I took the initiative and told my fiancé James Miller that I wanted to call off the engagement. But James refused, and before I went off to university he married me anyway. After we wed I took care of my in-laws and escrimped and saved to send him to school. Life was hard, but I was content. Then on one visit I said was to drop off money, I discovered him living with my best friend Emily Johnson, the two of them acting like a happily married couple. When I confronted them, Emily fell apart and cried pitifully. James put Emily behind him and, clearly annoyed, said to me, "It was my fault. I hired someone to push you into the river so Emily would have a better chance of getting into college. But I already married you. I gave you a husband who's a college student. Isn't that enough?" The shock of that truth made me so furious I had a heart attack. James hesitated. Emily grabbed his hand and pulled him away, leaving me alone to wait for death. Then I opened my eyes and I was back the day before the exam. This time I took the dress James had given me and handed it to Emily. "This dress is a bit big on me, take it. You can wear it to the exam tomorrow. Amelia, I really hope you won't go to the exam. Even though you're the one most likely to get into university, you're already engaged to James. Marriage is more important than college, of course. What use is a woman having a degree? If I had a man like that, I wouldn't take the exam either." My so-called best friend said all this with a tone of concern, beating the same drum she and my fiancé had been drumming ever since the Gaokao returned, ever since the three of us registered for the exam together. It seemed she said it every day. Back then I only thought she was narrow-minded and meant well. But now I was angrier than I'd ever been. Because I'd woken up again, and I remembered that tomorrow I would wear that new dress James had given me and be pushed into the river by a hooded figure on the road I had to take. miss the exam, lose my chance at college, and later lose the ability to bear children. With me out of the way, Emily and James both got into university. I didn't want to be a burden to James, so I offered to break the engagement. But James not only refused, he married me early. I was moved and spent my savings to support his studies while I cared for his parents at home. Because I couldn't have children, I endured their disdain. Only by constantly providing money did I scrape by in the Miller household. I planned to save up and take the exam myself later. But I never imagined the person who shoved me into the river that day would turn out to be James. He'd hired someone to do it so Emily would have a better chance at university. Thinking of that moment of utter despair, of being betrayed by the one I loved and the one I trusted most, I wanted to strangle Emily with my own hands. Emily saw my expression and rolled her eyes. Amelia, I did all this for your own good. Look how well James treats you. He gave up his food rations, sewing and saving just to buy you a new dress for the exam. With a man like that, what more could you want? I lowered my eyes and sneered, but didn't say anything. That tiny sneer was enough to set Emily off. Amelia, what do you mean by that? I'm doing this for you and you give me this attitude. You must apologize or I won't forgive you. I wasn't surprised. Emily came from a poor family and had a younger brother. She'd often nick things from me whenever she could. I calmed myself and thought it true, whoever pushed me tomorrow was likely James. Current Emily probably didn't know anything. After all, if she had known she wouldn't keep pestering me to skip the exam. So I sighed. Emily, you've misunderstood. I'm just nervous about the exam. Everyone says I'm sure to get in, and I'd be so ashamed if I failed. She gave me a cold look. So what? You can't take my kindness and turn it into insult, and now you throw a tantrum at me? I looked contrite and fumbled for a solution. After a moment I said, don't be angry. How about this? Take the dress James gave me. You'll look better in it than I do. Wear it to the exam tomorrow and you'll do great. Molly's anger dissolved into delight. She snatched the dress to her chest. That's more like it. As she turned to leave with the dress, I stopped her. Wait. Emily frowned. What? You want it back? Once it's in my hands, it's mine. Don't even think about taking it. I shook my head. No, I just wanted to tell you, don't take the path by the village entrance tomorrow. Go the long way around. Some classmates said there's a mentally unstable person over there. I'm worried you might get hurt. Naomi hummed and muttered, where did you hear about that? I think you just don't want me to get noticed. I pretended not to hear and went on, no, by the way, this dress was a gift from James. Don't tell him I passed it on to you, or he'll get mad at me. Emily made a couple of distracted noises, clearly afraid I'd say more, then hugged the dress and ran home, bubbling with excitement. The next day arrived quickly. I put on the plainest outfit I owned, pulled a hat down low, and took a long detour before I reached the exam site. It wasn't until I sat down and the test paper was placed in front of me that I finally relaxed. I forced myself to suppress my excitement and focused on the questions. Even though everyone said I was the likeliest to get into university, I'd been nervous coming in. After all, I hadn't taken the exam the first time, so I couldn't be certain I'd do well. But these questions were within my grasp. This time I would claim the university spot that belonged to me. Who knows how long passed, but when the bell rang to end the exam I handed in an answer sheet I was proud of. Feeling light and almost giddy, I rose to leave and saw James Miller standing at the exam gate, asking passing students and neighbors, have any of you seen Emily today? Seeing the worried, hopeful look on his face made me want to laugh. After all, although he was my fiancé, he'd never looked at me like that. At the time I'd written it off as shyness, but now I realized, he wasn't shy, he just never cared about me. He'd only ever cared about Emily. He'd gotten engaged to me because I was an orphan with some money and could lift him up. His heart belonged to Emily Johnson alone. After the exam in my previous life, he didn't come to find me. He took Emily to a state-run restaurant and used the money I'd secretly slipped him to give Emily an early celebration. He didn't visit my bedside until the next day. When the doctor told him I'd merely drowned and, because it had coincided with my period and led to an infection, I might never have children. He only showed the faintest hint of remorse. He seemed about to say something, but Emily tugged his sleeve and the tiny trace of guilt vanished exactly like the way he locked the door in my face while I begged for my life during my heart attack. That day James shut the door in front of me. I cried, "Please save me. I'll divorce you. Let me go so you can be with her." James looked moved for a moment, but Emily snapped at him, "No, she's manipulating you. A dead woman and an ex-wife, of course the dead woman looks better in comparison. What if she goes around telling people about the exam or claiming you two had an affair or demanding you pay her back? What would you do then?" James glanced between us and then, with a shove, pulled his trouser leg from my hand. "I know your character. You won't agree to a divorce easily. I can't risk Emily's reputation. A girl's good name is everything. A reputation matters, but does life not?" I hung my head and slipped to the side, waiting until James left before I walked out of the exam hall. I didn't go home, I went straight to the hospital. I had my heart checked. I didn't want to die of a heart attack again. After a thorough examination, the doctor gave me a reassuring look. "Your heart is perfectly fine. Don't let your imagination run wild. As long as you rest and keep your emotions steady, your heart should last you to 100 years old." Hearing that, I smiled. It seemed my last life's heart attack had been brought on by exhaustion. I'd pushed myself into a machine-like state to make sure James could study without worry. After the drowning, I hadn't gotten proper treatment, I overworked myself, and then the two of them had tormented me. No heart, however strong, could have borne all that. But not this time. When I stepped out of the clinic, I heard a swarm of people whispering in the corridor. "Did you hear? That Dot was pushed into the river, almost drowned." "I know. It was a girl. Maybe there was some romantic entanglement, someone got jealous and did it. What a pity. The Gaokao can change a life. She missed her chance, she might never get another. She nearly drowned. How could she be thinking about exams?" I knew they were talking about Emily Johnson. To keep from laughing out loud, I pinched my thigh until it hurt, then grabbed the arm of a woman nearby and feigned shock. "Sister, what's the name of that candidate you mentioned? I'm a candidate too, I might know her." The woman startled, then said, "I think her name's Emily Johnson or something. She's lying in the ward up ahead. Go look and see if it's someone you know." I hurried into Emily Johnson's hospital room, almost running, and was greeted by the sound of crying. Emily was lying in bed with her eyes squeezed shut. I froze. Had Emily Johnson died? Before I could process it, Emily's mother spotted me and grabbed my arm. "How dare you show up here? If you hadn't insisted on Emily going to the exam to change her life, how could she have fallen into the river? How could she be in a coma now?" Other relatives and friends of Emily's joined in, pointing their fingers at me and angrily scolding me. "Yes, this is your fault. I had a great match for Emily, and now everyone knows she was saved by a homeless man. How is she ever going to get married now? Why does a girl have to go to college anyway? This is karma. You'll have to take responsibility, pay us back. Emily can't get married now, so you have to give your dowry to Emily's brother to get him a wife. Yeah, this is all your fault." The more they spoke, the more absurd it became, and I rolled my eyes. Emily Johnson is an adult. She wanted to take the exam on her own. What does that have to do with me? If you're so capable, why don't you go find the person who pushed her into the river and leave me out of it? Is it just because I have no parents that you think I'm easy to bully? What else do you know how to do other than picking on the weak? Besides, I already told Emily not to take the exam. With her abilities, the chance of getting in wasn't high. She didn't listen to me. What could I have done? The moment those words left my mouth, it stirred up a hornet's nest. They all began shouting the most hurtful things, and if it weren't for a few of them being too scared to do anything, I probably would have been torn apart by their anger. I argued with them for a while, but eventually lost interest and walked out of the room. As soon as I stepped out of the room, I saw James Miller anxiously searching through each ward. His news seemed to have reached him fast. I wasn't sure what he knew exactly, so I quickly rubbed my eyes and put on the look of someone who had just been crying. When James saw me standing there, perfectly fine, he visibly sighed in relief, but then his face turned serious, and he scolded me. Why didn't you let anyone know you were fine? I'd been worried sick about you, don't you know that? I kept telling you to lay low, but you went around making enemies. I almost went crazy when I heard from classmates that you were in the hospital. James Miller rattled on like a machine gun, and I just stood there, staring at him in confusion, as if I hadn't heard a word he said. After a while, he noticed I seemed like I had just been crying, and perhaps the guilt was getting to him, or maybe he was just pretending to care. He sighed and started to comfort me. All right, don't cry. I'm not mad at you. I'm just worried about you. You know, the more you love someone, the more you scold them, don't you get that? Most importantly, you're fine. The Gaokao is just an exam. You missed it once, but there will be another chance. Don't be upset. When I heard this, I cried even harder. I understand the logic, but Emily has worked so hard for this exam. You know this. If she doesn't make it this time, she'll be forced to marry and exchange her dowry. How can she have another chance after that? She's my best friend, and now a stranger pushed her into the river and ruined her life. She's still unconscious, and how can I not be upset? James Miller's expression turned disgusted, as if he had just eaten something rotten. He interrupted my rambling and grabbed my arm, his voice turning sharp. What did you say? Who was pushed into the river? I looked at him in confusion. I never thought you cared so much about Emily. Didn't you always say you didn't like being around her? In the past, James would always tell me he disliked Emily Johnson, and like a fool, I believed him. I kept trying to play matchmaker between the two of them, hoping they'd get along for my sake. Now that I think about it, they probably found that behavior laughable. James must have realized this too, because his expression became awkward. He cleared his throat and said, "She's a classmate, of course I care. Just tell me what happened to Emily." I sighed. On her way to the exam, Emily was pushed into the river by a stranger and missed the chance to take the exam. I was so nervous at the exam, I forgot about her and you. After I finished the exam, I felt a little dizzy and came to the hospital. That's when I heard Emily had fallen into the water. James stumbled a couple of steps. If I hadn't grabbed his arm, he might have fainted. His reaction was completely different from the last time he heard about me nearly drowning. But I wasn't done yet. I kept going. If she had just missed the exam, it would have been bad, but not the end of the world. The truth is, Emily didn't stand a chance of passing anyway, unless someone gave up the exam. With her grades, she wouldn't have gotten in. But the problem is, Emily can't swim. After she fell in, she almost drowned. It was only because a passing homeless man saved her. I wasn't there, but now that the weather's hot and everyone's dressed lightly, I heard Emily was pulled out with her shirt undone. Now Emily's reputation is ruined. What is she going to do now? I was still talking when James Miller suddenly couldn't take it anymore. He shoved me aside and stormed into Emily's room. I followed him, of course. I wasn't about to miss such a spectacle. As soon as James Miller walked into the hospital room, Emily Johnson's mother grabbed him by the arm. "James, what are we going to do now? Didn't you say you had a way to make sure Emily could get into college?" That homeless man, he's already 50. Not only did he grab Emily, but he even performed CPR on her in public. Now everyone's saying he saved her, that Emily owes him, and expects her to repay him with herself. Nonly's only 20. I only have this one daughter, Emily. How could I possibly let her marry a homeless man? Her words made sense. There was no way Emily Johnson could be forced to marry a homeless man. He was too poor, and even in today's progressive times, being rescued from drowning and having intimate contact during the rescue made the situation awkward. Nonly, at 20, would naturally find it difficult to comply. I stood at the doorway, trying hard not to laugh, while James Miller's face grew progressively more grim. Finally, he, half kneeling by the bedside, grabbed Emily's hand. "Emily, wake up, it's me, James. Please wake up. Perhaps it really is true that love can work miracles." After James called her a few times, Emily Johnson actually opened her eyes. She looked around in confusion. How did I end up here? Everyone froze for a moment, but I quickly realized what had happened. It seemed the shock had caused a brief memory lapse, so I rushed over to help her regain her bearings. Molly, you're finally awake. You scared me to death. It doesn't matter if you didn't get into college. The most important thing is that you're alive. Your reputation, or your so-called innocence, doesn't matter either. At worst, you'll stay unmarried for life. I will never let you marry that homeless man. After my patient explanation, Emily Johnson finally snapped back to reality. She pointed at me angrily. It's you, you did this on purpose. I blinked. How could this possibly be my fault? Emily Johnson nearly lost it. That outfit, you gave it to me, and the man shouted your name before he pushed me, and only when I responded did he let me go. If you hadn't offended him and then forced me to accept the outfit, how could I have ended up in trouble? Emily's mother and relatives started to react, their anger shifting toward me. You see, that's your fault. How could you be so kind, so generous, just giving away such a fashionable outfit? What did Emily ever do to you for you to do this to her? Do you know what you've done to Emily's future? How can you be so cruel? I stood there helpless, finally saying, how can this be my fault? First, this outfit was brand new, no one knew it was mine. Second, it wasn't exactly given to Emily, she basically snatched it from me. Emily Johnson was furious. You're talking nonsense. I sighed but didn't continue arguing. Besides, I told you yesterday not to take that path. I saw there might be a mentally unstable person there and I was worried you'd get hurt. If I wanted this to happen, why would I warn you? Emily Johnson scowled but tried to argue, there's been a mentally ill person at the village entrance for years, and everyone's been fine. Your warning is meaningless with your body type anyway. I didn't counter that, but pressed further, and anyway, he called my name, why did you respond? That makes no sense. If what you said is true, that someone's taking revenge on me, why would he not recognize me? Besides, if I wanted to stop you from going to the exam, what would I gain? I've been good to you, you know that. The room fell silent. Though everyone was still fussing, my questions had left them momentarily stumped. Indeed. I had clearly warned Emily not to take that path, yet she insisted. She responded when the man called my name. Logically, none of this made sense. But I knew the truth perfectly. Emily Johnson and James Miller had long been in love. To provoke me, they devised a scheme using James Miller to essentially engage with me. I had always been popular wherever I went. People often called my name, hoping to befriend me. Emily, in order to keep my attention, frequently pretended to be me, both to block me from forming other connections, and to gauge if someone better might appear. I had known this all along. I trusted Emily so completely that I thought everything she did was for my sake, but James Miller eventually figured it out too. Shut up, he snapped. No matter what, this is your responsibility. No one has suffered on your behalf. You feel no guilt and yet you're still here, pressing me. As your fiancé, I now command you to take full responsibility. Since your mistake stopped Emily from getting into college, you'll give her your grades so she can go to school in your place. And you, he turned to me, will marry that homeless man in Emily's place. The Johnsons were overjoyed at this solution. I neither agreed nor refused. I only sighed. The real culprit is the one who pushed Emily into the water. Don't worry. I've already called the police. They'll find out who did this and make them pay. James Miller panicked, insisting not to involve the police. But it was too late, the officers had already pushed open the door. The moment the police entered, they were immediately surrounded by the Johnson family. Regardless of the details, everyone pointed fingers at me, convinced I was entirely to blame, and started shouting at the officers all at once. Officer, you came just in time. This wretched woman ruined my daughter's chances of getting into college and tarnished her reputation. Yes, you must make her compensate us real money, not just words. If she hadn't deliberately offended someone and made Emily wear that outfit, none of this would have happened. She should be thrown in jail. She should give her college spot to Emily. Emily deserves it. James Miller shot me a wide-eyed glance and muttered, "Are you insane? Why did you call the police? Now everyone's going to know." I snorted. "If you care about Emily, shouldn't she know the truth?" James Miller had no rebuttal, so he ran over and grabbed the officer's arm, pointing at me. "Officer, I'm James Miller, and I'm also a prospective student. I can testify Amelia Cross did this on purpose. She was jealous of Emily Johnson, so she deliberately gave me, James Miller, the outfit to Emily Johnson, and then provoked someone else, which caused Emily Johnson to be pushed into the water. This is attempted murder. You can't ignore this." The officers finally got a chance to speak over the chorus of yes, yes, from the crowd. They didn't even ask for more details, they simply looked at James Miller. "You're James Miller of the Miller family?" James Miller, confused, nodded. "Yes." The officers seemed relieved. "Good. You're exactly who we were looking for." Without giving anyone else a chance to react, they immediately handcuffed James Miller. The room froze. No one had expected this twist. Everyone had been planning to squeeze a little out of me, the soft target, but who could have imagined the real culprit was someone else entirely? James Miller's face shifted through every shade of shock and fury, yet he couldn't say a word, only shot me a resentful glare. In my previous life, after I woke up, I had been hit with the crushing news of missing exams and infertility. My mind had gone blank, I couldn't think of anything. By the time I tried to find someone to hold accountable, it was already too late. The police, ignoring the crowd's questions, explained, "Because Amelia Cross reported this promptly, we were able to investigate immediately and quickly locate witnesses. Following the evidence, we identified the person who pushed Emily into the water. After interrogation, he admitted to the act and named the mastermind. And that mastermind is James Miller." Emily Johnson shook her head. "Impossible, I don't believe it. I have no grudge against him, why would he harm me?" I lowered my head and said nothing. It seemed Emily Johnson had forgotten the person who pushed her had called my name first. She had only taken the fall for me. Since she didn't mention it, I had no reason to remind her. This had always been my plan, let the trouble go east. The police patiently explained the testimonies, and the Johnson family gradually snapped out of their shock, grabbing James Miller by the collar, demanding he be held accountable. If the officers weren't there, he likely would have been beaten badly. "James Miller, you yourself said this counts as attempted murder. You knew Emily Johnson couldn't swim and still hired someone to do this. You're coming with us. Explain yourself properly." As James Miller was being escorted to the door, he suddenly dropped to his knees, clutching my pants leg. "Amelia, please save me. I can't go to jail. You're so brilliant in your studies, you're bound to be a top scorer. Help me, just speak on my behalf, and I'll get special consideration. Just say a word. If you don't, I won't get to go to college, someone will make sure of it. I'm your fiancé, you can't just ignore me. Now you remember you're my fiancé. Where were you when you hired someone to push me into the water just to improve Emily Johnson's chances of getting into college? Where were you when you and Emily Johnson spent my money at school, pretending to be a couple? Where were you when you watched me suffer a heart attack, shut the door, and let me wait to die?" Thinking of all this, I gathered every ounce of strength and slapped James Miller hard across the face. "You don't deserve to be my fiancé. You disgust me." Without waiting for the police, I left the hospital first. I didn't expect it, but James Miller ultimately avoided prison because the Johnsons withdrew their charges. They did so, as in my previous life, only because James Miller had been admitted to college. The Johnsons knew Emily Johnson would never marry well, so they used the threat of prison to force James Miller to marry her. The two held a wedding, but conveniently, they didn't invite me. I heard the ceremony was modest. Even though the Miller family poured in all their savings, Emily Johnson's mother had kept the money for her son's future education and marriage, not for the wedding or their household. The Millers dared not protest, they literally held James Miller's life in their hands. I didn't care about the couple, Yet I often heard people gossiping about how perfect their relationship was, how sweet, how delighted James Miller's parents were with Emily Johnson. But I knew it was all a facade. I knew that their love wasn't as perfect as it seemed. The Miller family would never accept a daughter-in-law with a tainted reputation, and James Miller would never truly care for a burden like Emily Johnson. The reason I was being so nice to her now was simple. I didn't want anything else to happen before college. It was obvious that Emily Johnson's hard times were far from over. My exam scores hadn't made me the top student in the nation, but they were more than enough to let me choose freely among universities. I picked my favorite school and program, packed my things, and planned to leave early. But before heading off, I arranged to meet Emily Johnson at home. I wasn't planning to let her off so easily. Emily Johnson looked radiant, her expression full of pride as she glanced at me, completely different from the pitiful look she'd worn when I had caught her in the previous life. When I didn't say anything and just stared at her, she sneered. "What are you staring at? You're no better than me. Are you expecting me to feel guilty?" She glanced at my packed luggage with a hint of envy but straightened her neck stubbornly. "What, did you call me here just a flaw that you got into college? Big deal, you still can't beat me." Honestly, taking the exams didn't matter. We all knew I wouldn't get in. Now that I can marry James, I'll be the wife of a college student. He also promised me he'll study hard and give me a bright future. Watching her prideful little speech, I just sighed and said sincerely, "I'm sorry." The words caught Emily Johnson completely off guard. After all, she had stolen my college-gown fiancé and betrayed our friendship. How could it possibly be my place to apologize? Emily froze. What are you apologizing for?" I scowled, and under her repeated questioning, I finally said, "I guess you were willing to marry James Miller because he told you he originally wanted to hire someone to push me into the river, but accidentally pushed you instead, right?" Emily Johnson said nothing, but her expression confirmed my words. I sighed again. "Actually, that outfit James Miller gave me, tried it on and it was too big. It wasn't my size at all. So whether or not we argued that day, I would have given it to you anyway. And you wore it how well it fit, you don't need me to explain, right? James Miller knew full well that I would give you the clothes, which is why he deliberately chose a style and pattern I disliked. And that person calling my name by the river? That was just a trick to confuse you. James Miller was the one who had originally told me not to go near the village entrance. I didn't know about James Miller's plan until you two got married. Only after seeing how well he treated you did I piece it all together." Emily Johnson frowned. "What are you even talking about?" I didn't answer directly, instead asking, "I bet James Miller promised to take you to college with him, right? He deliberately wanted to isolate you, to find a way to harm you." Emily Johnson's expression changed. "You're lying, you're trying to turn me against him. Do you think I'll believe that?" I didn't rush to respond. I just looked at her with a trace of pity. "I know you don't believe me, but I have to tell you James Miller had already confessed everything about you. I wasn't angry because I trusted him to handle things properly. That's why I was a bit impatient with you the day before the exams. But I never expected his solution would be trying to drown you." Emily Johnson turned pale, but shook her head. "Impossible. I don't believe you. James has always treated me well." I cut her off. "Treated you well? Do you think any man would accept a woman who's had intimate contact with another man? Would any man like a burden like you? If you don't believe me, go home. Listen secretly to what James Miller's parents and he say about you when you're not around. Then you'll understand." Emily Johnson said nothing. She stumbled away, and I quietly followed her, carrying my luggage. I followed her to the Miller household and soon heard Emily Johnson yelling in fury. "James Miller, was that on purpose? Did you do it just to get rid of me? Just because I'm not a college student and have a family that's a burden, I'm not good enough for you? I shouldn't have let you go for the sake of feelings, I should have made sure you rot in jail." I didn't hear James Miller's voice, but soon caught snippets of his parents' replies. Their voices were quieter, so I only caught words here and there: impure, kissed another, gold-digging family, not like Amelia Cross, not worthy of James Miller, and so on. After listening for a while, I decided it was better to avoid trouble. I grabbed my luggage and left. When I arrived at the university for registration, I slowly learned the aftermath from former classmates. After a quarrel, Emily Johnson and James Miller quickly reconciled, but Emily Johnson had grown cautious. She constantly eavesdropped and eventually overheard James Miller and his parents discussing how to get rid of her. Emily Johnson was utterly devastated. She realized I hadn't been wrong. James Miller had indeed deliberately sent her to a university far away, hoping to accidentally let her die while she was there. Crushed by the dual blows of a threat to her life and betrayal by the one she loved, Emily Johnson completely lost control. In a shocking frenzy, she grabbed a knife and charged. James Miller was gravely injured and died on the spot, ending his sinful life. His parents were seriously hurt as well, though not fatally. However, their daily lives were now full of difficulties. Without their son, no one was left to care for them, and it was clear their remaining days would be anything but easy. Emily Johnson, on the other hand, was arrested for premeditated murder and ultimately sentenced to death. Shortly after her death, I unexpectedly received a letter from her. In it, she cursed me, blaming everything on me, and astonishingly claimed she knew I was a person who had been reborn. It didn't take long for me to realize that the death sentence had triggered her memories of her previous life. At the end of the letter, she smugly wrote, "After I die, I will also be reborn. Last time, I mercifully let you die of a heart attack. But when I'm reborn, I will do something 100 times more vicious than that fool James Miller. I will make you and his entire family suffer beyond imagination." Reading these threats, all I could do was laugh. A person who had lived a life full of wickedness, where would she even get the chance to be reborn? It was nothing more than a foolish dream. I casually tossed the letter into the trash and returned to my studies, because only by working hard could I truly change my own destiny.